Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be tackling a big question today. Had Hispanic-Americans achieved equality by the early 21st century?
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is, and we're going to be looking at this through the lens of a specific source, an episode transcript from Mr. Hutchings History.
Okay.
And this is just packed with information and insights and data and, different perspectives.
Yeah.
So
Sounds fascinating.
it is. I mean, just to give you one example that really kind of hit me.
Okay.
In the 1990s, Latino youths were 3 to 8 times more likely to be jailed than their white counterparts.
Wow.
So,
Yeah, that's a pretty stark statistic.
yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm really interested to kind of dig into this with you and see, what we can learn about this period.
Absolutely.
So let's start with this idea of racial tension.
Okay.
There's a new American media poll from December 2007, and it found that 93% of Hispanics saw racial tension as a major issue in the U.S.,
Yeah.
which is a huge number.
It is.
And what I think is really interesting about this is that it kind of goes beyond the usual black-white binary.
Right.
It's not just about those two groups.
Yeah.
And this source really highlights tensions between Hispanic and Black communities.
Yeah, and it really kind of digs into some of the reasons behind that as well.
Yeah, well, and it gives some really specific data points. Like, for example, over half of African Americans who were surveyed believe that Hispanic immigrants were competing with them for jobs and influence.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, 44% of Hispanics express fear of African Americans associating them with crime.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's this really complex picture, right? And it's not just about, one group's struggle for equality.
Right.
It's about these kind of interconnected challenges.
Absolutely, and I think it speaks to this idea, that equality isn't this kind of straight line of progress.
Right.
It's much more complex than that.
Yeah, it's like a web
Yeah.
almost with all these different threads.
Exactly.
So how do we even begin to kind of untangle that?
Well, I think it starts with acknowledging that the lived experiences of people don't always align with the legal progress that's been made.
Okay.
And this source really highlights that through, data from the Kaiser Family Foundation study, which was done in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And they found that Hispanic Americans, along with Asian and African Americans, experience discrimination at twice the rate of whites.
Oh, wow.
So that's a pretty significant difference.
And this wasn't just about, feeling discriminated against. This
Yeah.
was like measurable differences in how people were treated, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the study looked at things like, being threatened or attacked or treated with disrespect.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
So, the question then becomes why?
Yeah.
If we have all these laws in place to prevent discrimination,
Right.
why are we still seeing these disparities?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it points to something much deeper than just, laws on paper.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that there are these deep-seated biases and these systemic issues that are still creating these barriers.
Yeah, and I think one of the places where this becomes really obvious is in the realm of law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mr. Hutchings History episode really digs into the issue of racial profiling.
Yeah.
And, we talked about this statistic before about the Latino youths being more likely to be jailed.
Right.
But there's even more data than that.
Like, for example?
Like, for example, a New York State Attorney General report
Yeah.
from 1998 to 1999
Mm-hmm.
found that Latinos and African Americans made up 84% of police stops in New York City.
Wow.
Now consider this.
Okay.
They represented less than 50% of the population.
So it's a huge...
Yeah, huge discrepancy.
Yeah, what does that kind of over-policing do to a community?
Well, I think it creates this sense of being constantly under suspicion,
Yeah.
of being targeted just because of your race or ethnicity.
And it's not just about, individual officers who might be biased.
Right.
It's really about these systemic biases within law enforcement
Mm-hmm.
that have this ripple effect across generations.
Right. You can imagine what that does to a young person growing up in that environment
Absolutely.
where they're constantly seen as a potential criminal.
Yeah, being viewed with suspicion.
And as if this wasn't bad enough, the source material also highlights how immigration status gets woven into this already really fraught dynamic.
Right, yeah. It adds this whole other layer of complexity.
And there's this case from 2002.
Okay.
involving the Ohio State Highway Patrol,
Mm-hmm.
where officers were accused of stopping Latinos
Oh, wow.
solely based on their race to question their immigration status.
Hmm.
So basically, just being Hispanic was enough to make you a target.
Yeah, and that really raises some serious questions
It's pretty disturbing.
about, the legal and ethical boundaries of law enforcement.
Right.
Can race be used as the primary basis for suspicion?
Yeah. And I mean, the answer is,
The answer is no,
yeah, a resounding no.
both legally and ethically.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not acceptable.
And, within the larger Hispanic community,
Right.
some groups faced even more specific hurdles.
Yeah.
And the episode focuses on Puerto Ricans protesting police brutality
Okay.
in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Mm.
And what's interesting about this is that Puerto Rican communities experienced what the source describes as selective abuse and neglect
Wow, that's
from law enforcement.
Yeah, that's a powerful phrase.
So the question is why?
Right.
Why would Puerto Ricans be singled out in this way?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue.
And I think it has to do with their unique status, right?
I mean,
Because they're U.S. citizens.
Right.
But they often face discrimination based on their cultural and linguistic differences.
Right. It's like they're both American and othered at the same time,
Yeah.
which is a really difficult position to be in.
It's a paradox.
It is.
Yeah, so no wonder there was this growing sense of disillusionment
Mm.
among activists during this period.
Absolutely. And I think that sense of disillusionment is really crucial to understanding the historical context here.
Right.
It's against this backdrop of these systemic issues and this targeted discrimination
Mm-hmm.
that we really have to evaluate this question of equality.
So to get a broader perspective on this,
Okay.
Mr. Hutchings History brings in several historians,
Yeah.
each representing a different school of thought.
Okay.
So we're getting a round table discussion
I like that.
on the state of equality for Hispanic-Americans in the early 21st century.
That's a really great way to approach this complex issue.
So first up, we have Juan González representing the progressive perspective.
Okay.
What's his take on the situation?
Well, González, he's known for his work on Latino history and social movements,
Mm-hmm.
and he acknowledges the progress that's been made in terms of, mobilization and representation.
Mm.
But he emphasizes that these systemic barriers, particularly racial profiling, are still preventing full equality.
So he sees progress, but he also recognizes that there are these deeply embedded obstacles.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a simple picture.
Okay, what about Vicki Ruiz?
Okay.
She represents the social history school of thought.
So Ruiz really highlights the power of grassroots activism
Mm-hmm.
in achieving legal and civil rights gains for Hispanic Americans.
Okay.
She acknowledges, the crucial role of community organizing
Yeah.
in driving social change,
Mm-hmm.
but she's also critical of ongoing police misconduct
Okay.
and the persistent racial disparities that we've been talking about.
So she sees the agency of the community,
Mm-hmm.
but she doesn't shy away from the harsh realities that they're still facing.
Absolutely.
Okay, this brings us to Eduardo Bonilla-Silva,
Right.
representing critical race theory.
So Bonilla-Silva's analysis goes even deeper, I would say.
Okay.
He argues that racial profiling isn't just a problem in itself. It's a symptom of a much larger issue, which is systemic racism that's woven into the very fabric of American institutions.
Wow.
So it's not enough to just enact laws against discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
You have to address the root of the problem.
So you're saying that we need to, fundamentally shift the way our systems operate.
Yeah, I think that's what he's getting at.
Okay, and finally we have Ramon Grossfogel,
Okay.
who brings in a post-colonial perspective.
So Grossfogel offers this really unique global context.
Okay.
He links the inequality faced by Hispanic Americans to the legacy of U.S. imperialism.
Okay.
So he sees policing practices not just as a domestic issue,
Okay.
but as part of this broader pattern of neocolonial control.
So we have these four distinct lenses, each offering a different way of understanding the complexities of the Hispanic American experience.
And I think what's fascinating is how these perspectives both complement and challenge each other. They all agree that progress has been made,
Right.
but they differ in their assessments of how far we've come and what needs to be done to achieve genuine equality.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is.
Where do we even begin to make sense of all this?
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge the nuance.
Okay.
The reality is that by the early 21st century, Hispanic Americans had made strides in areas like political representation and cultural visibility, but
I feel like there's a but coming.
There is.
Yeah.
The reality is that deeply ingrained racial tensions, discrimination, and systemic issues continue to hold many back.
So it's not just a question of whether things were better than before.
It's about whether true equality had been achieved.
And based on this evidence?
And the answer is no.
No.
Not yet.
So what does it actually take to move beyond progress to true and lasting equality?
That's the question.
That's the question, and I think that's a question we need to delve into further. Let's continue this discussion in part 2 of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's a question that people have been grappling with for, generations.
Right.
And as we've seen, the answer is not simple.
It's complicated.
But one thing is clear from the Mr. Hutchings History episode. Achieving equality requires more than just acknowledging the problem.
Right.
We need to dismantle the very systems and structures that perpetuate it.
Okay, that sounds like a tall order.
It is.
What does that look like in a practical sense?
Well, let's consider the issue of racial profiling in law enforcement.
Okay.
The source material points to the need for comprehensive police reform.
Okay.
That means implementing stricter policies, holding officers accountable for misconduct, and investing in training that tackles implicit bias head-on.
So we can't just assume that bias will magically disappear?
No, definitely not.
You need to, actively address it.
We have to be proactive about it.
And, police reform is just one piece of the puzzle. We also need to address the root causes of inequality.
Right.
Things like poverty, lack of access to quality education disparities in healthcare.
All of these factors contribute to a cycle of disadvantage that disproportionately impacts minority communities.
Like we're trying to fix a leaky roof. Yeah.
But we're ignoring the cracks in the foundation.
You have to address those underlying issues.
Right.
If you want to create lasting change.
Speaking of underlying issues, let's go back to that new American media poll for a moment.
Okay.
The one that revealed those tensions between different minority groups, particularly between African-Americans and Hispanic-Americans?
Yeah. That's a really crucial point, and the Mr. Hutchings History episode really digs into that dynamic.
Because if minority groups are pitted against each other, it only benefits those in power.
Exactly.
Who want to maintain the status quo.
Divide and conquer is an age-old tactic, and it's used to suppress those who challenge existing power structures.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so crucial to recognize our shared experiences of oppression and work together to dismantle the systems that perpetuate division.
So how do we even start bridging these divides?
Well, the source material suggests that it starts with dialogue.
Okay.
Open and honest conversations that acknowledge the historical and systemic factors
That have led to these tensions.
So we need to create spaces where people from different backgrounds can come together.
Yeah, safe spaces where they can share their experience.
And build empathy.
And challenge our own preconceived notions along the way.
Right.
Unlearning ingrained biases is a continuous process.
It is.
It requires a willingness to confront our own prejudices.
Yeah.
And actively work to change them.
So it's about listening with an open mind.
Absolutely.
And a willingness to understand perspectives that might differ from our own.
That's key.
So we've talked about police reform addressing systemic inequality, building solidarity across racial and ethnic lines. What other pieces need to be in place to achieve true equality?
Well, the Mr. Hutchings History episode highlights the importance of ensuring equal access to opportunity.
Okay.
This means tackling disparities in areas like education, healthcare, housing, and employment.
Because even if you remove the overt discrimination, if people don't have equal access to resources
Exactly.
and opportunities, true equality will remain out of reach.
It's about leveling the playing field.
So we need to create a society where everyone, regardless of their background or ethnicity, has a genuine chance to thrive and reach their full potential.
I think that's the ultimate goal.
This all sounds great in theory.
Yeah.
How do we make it happen in the real world?
It requires a multi-pronged approach
Okay.
involving policy changes, community activism, and individual commitment.
So from the top down, from the bottom up, and from all sides.
You got it.
Oh,
On a
okay.
policy level, we need measures that promote economic justice, invest in underserved communities, and dismantle barriers to opportunity.
Okay.
We need activists and organizers to hold those in power accountable
Yeah.
and push for meaningful change.
And then on an individual level,
Yeah.
we all have a role to play
Absolutely.
in educating ourselves, challenging prejudice, and advocating for equality within our own spheres of influence.
It's a collective effort.
Yeah.
It requires each of us to do our part.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's often overlooked in these discussions about equality representation.
Right.
We tend to focus on the negative the discrimination, the disparities,
Mm-hmm.
but representation matters too,
It does.
right?
Seeing yourself reflected in positions of power in the media, in all aspects of society, can have a profound impact on your sense of belonging and your belief in your own possibilities.
So by the early 21st century, Hispanic Americans had made some progress in terms of representation.
Right.
There were more Hispanic elected officials, more Hispanic-owned businesses, and more Hispanic voices in popular culture.
Visibility is important.
Yeah, but was it enough?
Well, the Mr. Hutchings History episode suggests that representation is a starting point,
Okay.
not an end point.
So it's not just about having a seat at the table.
Right.
It's about having a voice that shapes the conversation.
Exactly. And it's about creating a culture where diverse perspectives are actively sought out.
And valued.
Yes, not just tolerated.
It's interesting to think about how far we've come in terms of representation, but also how far we still have to go.
Absolutely. And that's where the concept of intersectionality becomes really crucial.
Okay.
We need to consider how different identities, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, how all of these intersect and impact people's experiences.
So I can't just talk about Hispanic Americans as like this one big group.
Right, exactly right.
We have to acknowledge the nuances and complexities within the community itself.
There's diversity within diversity.
Yeah.
And understanding these nuances is key to developing effective solutions.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's been a bit heavy, frankly.
Yeah.
We've talked about discrimination, systemic issues, the need for solidarity, and representation.
A lot.
But let's end on a more hopeful note.
Okay.
What are some positive trends or developments that emerged in the early 21st century that give you hope for the future?
Well, despite the ongoing challenges, the Mr. Hutchings History episode does offer some glimpses of hope. One thing that stands out is the growing awareness and understanding of these complex issues.
So more and more people are recognizing the need for systemic change.
Yeah, and engaging in these difficult conversations.
About race equality, social justice.
Exactly.
And we're seeing this new generation of activists and organizers who are fearless in their demands for justice.
They're leveraging social media technology, innovative strategies to mobilize people and advocate for change in ways that we haven't seen before.
So they're not afraid to hold those in power accountable and demand action.
Which is essential for driving progress.
Yeah.
Another positive trend is the increasing diversity of the Hispanic community itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the Hispanic population is no longer a monolith.
Okay.
It encompasses individuals from diverse backgrounds, countries of origin, socioeconomic levels, and political ideologies.
So you're saying it's becoming more and more difficult to make sweeping generalizations
Exactly.
of Hispanic Americans as a whole.
And that diversity is a strength.
Yeah.
It challenges simplistic narratives.
Right.
And forces us to engage with the complexities of identity and experience.
And it makes the fight for equality even more nuanced and complex.
But also, I think, more interesting.
And ultimately more hopeful.
I agree, because when we embrace our differences and work together towards a common goal, that's when real lasting change happens.
Okay, so to summarize this part of our deep dive, it sounds like the early 21st century was a period of both progress and persistent challenges for Hispanic Americans.
A mixed bag.
Yeah, there were significant strides made, but true equality remained elusive.
And achieving that equality requires a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
It involves addressing systemic issues, building solidarity, promoting genuine representation, and embracing the rich diversity within the Hispanic community itself.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said.
And speaking of journeys, let's take a quick detour and explore some specific case studies and examples that really bring these complexities to life in part 3 of our deep dive. All right, so we've spent the last 2 parts, kind of looking at the broad landscape of equality for Hispanic Americans in the early 21st century.
Yeah, kind of setting the stage.
Yeah, now I want to zoom in a little bit.
Okay.
And look at some specific examples from the Mr. Hutchings History episode.
All right, sounds good.
That really bring these abstract concepts to life.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
So one of the things that really stood out to me was the NYPD stop and frisk data.
Right.
From 1998 to 1999. Remember, Latinos and African Americans made up 84% of those stopped by police?
Yeah, a staggering number.
Even though they represented less than half the population.
That data really illustrates the reality of racial profiling.
It's hard to ignore those numbers.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how many innocent people were subjected to, unnecessary scrutiny and humiliation.
Absolutely.
Simply because of their race.
And it raises serious questions about the fairness of these law enforcement tactics. When the vast majority of those targeted are from specific racial or ethnic groups,
Yeah.
you have to wonder about the role of bias.
Whether it's conscious or unconscious.
Exactly.
The episode also highlights the 2002 case involving the Ohio State Highway Patrol.
Oh, right.
Where officers were accused of stopping Latinos solely based on their race.
To question their immigration status.
Right, and that really gets to the heart of how immigration enforcement can be used as a tool for racial profiling.
It shows how someone's appearance can be used to justify suspicion.
Even if they haven't done anything wrong.
Exactly. It's the perception of someone as being foreign or illegal.
That's really dangerous.
It is. And the episode points out how this creates a climate of fear and distrust within immigrant communities.
Imagine being afraid to interact with law enforcement.
Right. Even when you need help.
Because you're afraid of being targeted because of your ethnicity.
Or your perceived immigration status.
It's a chilling effect.
It really is. And it can have devastating consequences.
So we've talked a lot about racial profiling in law enforcement. But what about discrimination in other areas of life?
Well, the Kaiser Family Foundation study that we talked about earlier provides some pretty compelling evidence. Remember, they found that Hispanic-Americans experience discrimination at twice the rate of whites.
Right, and that included not just subtle biases.
Yeah, it was things like being threatened, attacked, or treated with disrespect.
It's a reminder that discrimination isn't just about hurt feelings.
Yeah.
It can have a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. These experiences can range from being denied housing or employment to being subjected to harassment.
And it creates this sense of not belonging.
Yeah, of being treated as less than equal.
And it's important to remember that discrimination isn't always intentional.
That's true.
Sometimes it's unconscious biases.
Right. And that's why it's so important to have open and honest conversations.
Yeah.
To challenge our own assumptions.
Okay, so we focused a lot on the challenges and the instances of discrimination and inequality.
Right. It's important to acknowledge those.
Yeah. But I think we should also talk about progress.
Definitely.
What were some of the positive developments that emerged for Hispanic Americans in the early 21st century?
Well, one of the most significant areas of progress was in political representation.
Okay, so more Hispanic elected officials.
Exactly, at all levels of government.
Which is important because it gives them a voice.
Absolutely. They can advocate for their needs.
Influence policies.
Shape legislation.
Yeah.
It's a crucial step towards empowerment.
And beyond the political sphere,
Yeah.
there was this surge in Hispanic cultural visibility.
Right.
Think about the rise of Latin music and film and television.
It really helped to challenge stereotypes.
And it created a space for new stories and experiences to be shared.
Absolutely.
So it challenged those dominant narratives that often exclude minority communities.
And it created new economic opportunities.
Right, for Hispanic artists, entrepreneurs, businesses.
It really broadened the community's influence in American society.
So even though there were ongoing challenges,
Yeah.
it's clear that the early 21st century was also a time of progress and growing empowerment.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yep.
what's the key takeaway?
Well, I think it's that the early 21st century was a pivotal period for Hispanic Americans, a time of both significant strides and enduring challenges.
So progress, but also persistent inequality.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the fight for equality is a marathon, not a sprint.
It requires sustained effort
And vigilance
and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
to address the root causes of inequality.
We encourage you to explore this topic further.
Yeah, check out the Mr. Hutchings History episode and the sources we've discussed
And most importantly, we hope this deep dive has sparked a desire to engage in these conversations.
about race equality and social justice.
And to consider how each of us can contribute to creating a more just and equitable society for all.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.